So we're in part 4 of Reasons and Persons, Future Generations. Chapter 16 was the non-identity problem. And in the non-identity problem, Parfit raises the issue that it looks like some policies that affect future generations, which seem clearly terrible, seem obviously morally wrong, if we use our usual way of working out why something is wrong, it's wrong if it makes things worse for people, that method cannot explain why these policies are wrong, because of this issue that our policies will affect who it is that exists. So if you make a social policy, it will probably affect when people reproduce. As we've seen, if people are worse off in a recession, they delay having children, that kind of thing. So it's just a fact that pervasive enough social policies affect who it is comes into existence. So even something like what he calls in Chapter 16 the risky policy, where we invest heavily in nuclear power that produces all these barrels of radioactive waste, knowing that we'll be safe for a couple of hundred years, but knowing also that because of seismic activity, after that time it's very likely that the barrels will leak and cause mass deaths. It seems like the risky policy seems obviously wrong because of its effect on future generations. But because of the non-identity problem, we can't say that what we're doing is bad for the people who are affected, because if we don't institute the policy, the risky policy, those people will never exist at all. So if those people, if we could ask, get on our future phones and ask those people in the future, would you rather not exist? They would say, no, sure, we're going to have kind of crappy lives. We're going to, have short lives that are ended by terminal cancer, but at least we get to exist. So it looks like the people who are affected, we're not affected by we benefit by the risky policy because we get cheap nuclear power or whatever. But even the people that we think we're wronging, it looks like, according to the non-identity problem, they wouldn't object. And yet it seems clearly wrong to institute the risky policy. It seems like we should institute a policy that is better for future generations. So, because of the non-identity problem, Parfit says we need to find theory X. We need to find a theory that explains why the risky policy is wrong, and tells us how we should care for people in future generations whose existence is sort of contingent on what we do in the present day. So after Chapter 16, he's devoting himself to the pursuit of this theory that gives the right answers in cases like the risky policy. Well, one of the things that he decides in Chapter 16 is we've got to get rid of this idea that the way to spell out something being wrong is it has to be wrong for a person for it to be wrong. He says we've got to get rid of that because that's what's causing the non-identity problem. We have to have a theory that can say that things are wrong even though we can't point to a particular individual and say they're wrong because that person is worse off. Because, as I said, even in the case of the risky policy, we point to those people who are dying of cancer. Clearly they're suffering, but because our policy also was what caused them to exist in the first place, so long as their life was worth living, and even people who die of cancer, you say, look, my life was worth living, they wouldn't say that it would be better if they hadn't existed. So theory X has to come up with a theory of beneficence that doesn't have this feature, so that tells us that the risky policy is bad. Obviously, a better way to do this that would avoid the non-identity problem would be, in some sense, to come up with impersonal principles. So, for example, on page 386 in the chapter, The Repugnant Conclusion, chapter 17, he suggests, suppose there is, he gives us two alternatives. There's the impersonal average principle or the impersonal total principle. So the impersonal average principle says, if other things are equal, remember, theory X isn't a theory of all morality. It's just a theory of our duties to, in this case, future generations. So it can be incorporated with other aspects of philosophy, of moral theory. He doesn't think that theory X is like utilitarianism, for example, is supposed to be a general theory of all morality. Theory X isn't necessarily like that. It's just focused on this one area. So when it says if other things are equal, that's a little clause that says that theory X can be trumped by other principles that are part of our general morality. If other things are equal, the best outcome is the one in which people's lives go, on average, best. So this looks like it could deal with a non-identity problem because the risky policy looks like it's going to cause great suffering down the line, so that's going to lower the average good in people's lives, and it looks like this might be a way to argue against the risky policy. Or the alternative is the impersonal total principle. If other things are equal, the best outcome is the one in which there will be the greatest quantity of happiness, the greatest net sum of happiness minus misery. That's the hedonistic version, and then he gives a non-hedonistic version. And there are problems with both of these. So basically the rest of the fourth part of Reasons and Persons is his attempt to come up with theory X, and every time he tries to solve one problem, a new problem emerges. So theory X right now is trying to avoid the non-identity problem. So let's say we have the impersonal total principle. The problem with the impersonal total principle is that it will lead to the repugnant conclusion. The repugnant conclusion says that essentially this is better than this. Okay, what do these represent? So each of these, the width represents how many people there are. So because this is future generations, our policies can affect how many people live. So we have to make a decision. How many people is the best number of people to exist? Remember, China had a one-child policy. I believe they've relaxed that a little. But China had a one-child policy, which was clearly a policy affecting how many people could exist in China. They decided that at their current rates of expansion, there would be too many people. Well, what's too many people? I mean, why don't you want more and more people? Because, most people, the vast majority of people, say that their lives are worth living. So shouldn't we have as many people as possible? Well, of course, what we find out is that overpopulation can lead to a great lowering in the quality of life. You get, the very phrase overpopulation makes this clear, that if there are too many people, they use up too much resources, and the quality of life in general declines. So this is the quantity of people, and this is the quality of life. So A says there's a comparative, A is supposed to be 10 billion people. So he thinks that 10 billion people, which we're at 8 billion right now. A couple of weeks ago, it said we hit 8 billion. So we're getting near to his 10 billion number. And he says 10 billion people, great quality of life. Is that, how do we compare? Our theory should tell us which of these is better. And, but what our intuitions tell us very clearly is that this one, at least, is better than this. This is just a vast number of people. That's what the dotted line represents, that this is a absolutely huge number of people whose lives are barely worth living. This is a very, very low quantity. It's not zero, it's not negative, but it's a very low quantity, very low quality of life. So this is just like teeming masses of people barely having miserable lives, lives that are just above the bare minimum. And it looks like that is clearly worse than this. But our impersonal total principle says that this is obviously better. In fact, our impersonal total principle implies the repugnant conclusion, which is on page 388, and he puts it this way. For any possible population of at least 10 billion people, all with a very high quality of life, that's A, there is some much larger imaginable population whose existence, if other things are equal, would be better by the principle, but obviously not according to what we would think, even though its members have lives that are barely worth living. So in trying to solve the non-identity problem by saying, okay, now we've got to come up, our theory of beneficence, that's sort of doing good to other people, in case you're not familiar with beneficence. Our theory of beneficence has to give the right answer in cases like the risky policy, and in order to give the right answer in cases like the risky policy, we have to make it non-person affecting. But in doing that, in making it impersonal, in saying what we're focusing on is not on whether or not we made things better for particular people, we just sort of say there is a good thing that we've got to maximize, and it doesn't matter who gets the good thing. Well, then we say, look, calculate the area of this. It's bigger than the area of this. The area of each of these squares represents the quantity of the good thing, and this is the biggest quantity. So our impersonal total principle implies this repugnant conclusion. And we've hit another impasse. So at the moment, we thought that we were progressing towards theory X by arguing that what is bad doesn't have to be bad for a particular person. Then if we reached that, we had the non-identity problem because we were committed to this idea something is bad if it makes things worse for particular people. But as we saw in the risky policy doesn't make things worse for the people it affects, because they wouldn't have existed if it hadn't been for the risky policy. So the risky policy also brings them into existence, as well as making them die of cancer. But their existence, that is still better for them than not existing, which is the alternative. So they would still choose the risky policy. That's wrong. That's the wrong conclusion. how do we fix this problem so we avoid the non-identity problem? We get rid of this idea that it has to be worse for particular people. Well, what's the obvious suggestion? The impersonal total principle, which sounds a lot like utilitarianism. You know, we should maximize happiness in general. And that leads to this horrible conclusion that, you know, that essentially, and notice what this would imply. This would seem to imply that because this is the best alternative out of all of these, each of these is, you know, here we have twice as many people as A, but more than half the quality of life. So it looks like B is better than A by the impersonal total principle. And C is better than B because, again, we've doubled it. We've doubled the quantity, and we're still above half the quality. And we keep doing this, and at each stage, the one on the right is better than the one on the left until you reach this one, which is the best. That is what you get by committing to the impersonal total principle. And that's why the impersonal total principle cannot be theory X. We have to go back to the drawing board. And in the next chapter, the absurd conclusion, he says, okay, we've got to try and weight quantity and quality. Because Parfit is actually okay with the idea that, for example, Benatar would reject vociferously, that bringing people into existence benefits them. Now, he says it benefits them because it's good for them. That doesn't mean that it's better for them than not existing, because as we've seen, it's very tricky. People are very leery of comparing existence to non-existence. Again, Benatar is okay with that, but most people would say you can't say that it is better to exist than not to exist. But what Parfit says is you can say if we bring people into existence, it's good for them because they have a life that's worth living. So we do benefit those people by bringing them into existence. And if we believe that, it looks like we'll be led to this. It looks like if we believe this, we have a duty to produce as many children as possible. I mean, it sounds like, I don't know if you're familiar with the quiverful movement amongst Christians. This is basically you've got to have as many children as possible. Now, I think it's largely so that there are as many Christians as possible rather than as many people as possible. But it looks like if we're not careful, we'll have a theory that tells you you've got to have as many children as possible, even though it'll drive down the quality of life, because it won't drive down the quality of life enough to make it so that the extra quantity isn't a good thing. The extra quantity is still better at every time. And that just seems very dubious that we should have a duty to just overrun the world with human beings. So he's got to theory X, which he's continually trying to refine, obviously must have to balance in some way quality and quantity. And in the next chapter, the absurd conclusion, he looks at various strategies for balancing. It looks like one of the best strategies might be the average total, because remember, this is the impersonal total principle. What about the impersonal average principle? That looks like that might be able to avoid the repugnant conclusion, because if you're shooting for the average, the highest average quality of life, the highest average good stuff for each person, whatever your theory of well-being might be, happiness usually, if you're shooting for the highest average, then it looks like A wins, because A has the highest average. Z has the lowest average. So maybe that's the simplest solution, that we should go for the highest average. But as we'll see in the next chapter, that has any number of problems too. So essentially, this part of the book is just Parfit bringing up one problem after another, solving that problem, and then realizing that in solving that problem, it's raised another problem. And I don't want to give you a spoiler, but we never get theory X. We do make negative progress towards theory X because we learn what theory X can't be, but we never actually get theory X. And in fact, this part of Reasons and Persons has led to a philosophical industry. Actually, it's not just philosophers. This is something that economists and policymakers are interested in. This is one of the reasons why Reasons and Persons is so influential, that he's sort of really, he wasn't the first person to bring up some of these issues, but he really sort of turbocharged this discussion and brought up, raised all kinds of issues that people hadn't really thought of before. And now population ethics is a huge field in a huge field, not just philosophers, but it's trying to come to a theory of what policy we should have. I mean, should we just have as many children as possible? It looks like it would be odd if we, if your parents were right that, you should be giving them grandchildren. It's not just that you should be giving them grandchildren because it's good for them, but it's just good. You have a duty. That seems an odd conclusion. But if we're not careful, that's where our theory will lead to. The repugnant conclusion.